Le drame de l'Afrique, c'est que l'homme africain n'est pas assez entré dans l'histoire. Le paysan africain, qui depuis des millénaires vit avec les saisons, dont l'idéal de vie est d'être en harmonie avec la nature, ne connaît que l'éternel recommencement du temps, rythmé par la répétition sans fin des mêmes gestes et des mêmes paroles.
This is not our war, it is not our fight. We want to go. We want to go.
As they flee, many will be treated as second-class citizens.
We are not allowing any black people to enter inside.
Talking to lawmakers in the Oval Office about protections for immigrants. Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here? According to a Democratic aide familiar with the conversation, Mr. Trump was referring to African nations and Haiti.
What do all three videos that you have just watched have in common? They all address a long-standing perception of Africans in the Western world, a perception that Africans have not made a sufficient mark in history with a capital H, that they still bring nothing to the table and therefore still don't really matter in the world stage today, and that they live on a continent that is rife with chaos and poverty. This narrative is one that so many younger Africans have fought to deconstruct in the last few years, bringing to light glorious chapters of our pre-colonial history or showcasing our cultural diversity and richness and the talent and potential of our growing population. It all sort of feels like we have to prove to the world over and over that the labels that it has ascribed to us aren't fair. But while we keep fighting stereotypical and reductive narratives about Africa coming from abroad, some of us are just starting to realize that on this continent made of 54 countries that we call Africa and often speak of as a united entity, systemic racism, xenophobia, and prejudice are real and problematic. On this new episode of Beyond the Noise, we take a closer look at how Africans have interacted and perceived each other in the post-colonial context and what needs to be done to break down some barriers that we are still grappling with today. By now, you all know the gist. Before we get into this topic, don't forget to subscribe to Beyond the Noise Africa, our channel on YouTube, and turn on your notification bell for more stories like these right here. This is no breaking news. Africa is a vast continent and a diverse one. It is home to at least 54 countries that we essentially inherited from the colonial era, when European powers imposed improper border designs while scrambling for political influence and power. This meant that African communities could not move freely in their daily life and activities, which inflicted economic hardship and social inconvenience. During the independence era, for the most part, those unnatural partitions and artificial countries, so to speak, were consolidated and kept by new rulers. And while our border map sort of looks like a geometric puzzle or a game of Tetris, when you look at African ethnicity maps, they tell a totally different story. On this Harvard University map of ethnicity edited by anthropologist Mark Leo Felix, for example, each color roughly corresponds to an ethnic group that constitutes the majority in that region based on how people self-identify. It's no wonder many citizens of one country are connected to communities in another, but also paradoxically, why groups within a single one can't seem to cohabit in peace. But it's a little bit more complex than that. In February 2023, Tunisian President Kais Saied sparked outrage across the continent and beyond for making xenophobic and racist comments targeting sub-Saharan migrants in a national address. He described undocumented Black African immigrants as hordes bringing violence and crime to Tunisia. He then went on to embrace the white supremacist Great Replacement conspiracy theory and alleged that immigration from sub-Saharan African countries is aimed at changing Tunisia's demographic composition. Unfortunately, his speech caused tangible damage. On social media, racist accounts moved to amplify Saied's divisive message using xenophobic rhetoric and started encouraging mob violence against Black Africans. This viral video from late February, for example, shows a man decrying the incompatibility of Black African values with those of Tunisians. He then goes on to say that he knows Africans well because, I quote, "My grandfather used to buy and sell them." Shocking, right? Except this man, whose film comments garnered more than 600,000 views on Twitter, did address the elephant in the room. That, to an extent, explains why Kais Said's comments are symptomatic of a broader and widespread issue in North Africa. We have all heard of the transatlantic slave trade, but not everyone knows about the Arab-Muslim slave trade, also known as the trans-Saharan trade or Eastern slave trade. According to many scholars, it is noted as the longest slave trade, having occurred for more than 1,300 years while taking millions of Africans away from their continent to work in foreign lands in the most inhumane conditions. While official figures on the exact number of slaves captured from Africa in the trans-Saharan trade are contested, most scholars put the estimate at about 9 million. Now, Senegalese academic Tidiane Ndiaye has argued that the legacy of this slave trade is rooted in the way Black Africans are treated in North Africa to this day. In his book titled The Veiled Genocide, he writes, and I quote, "Most of the millions of men they deported have disappeared as a result of inhumane treatment. This painful page in the history of Black people has apparently not been completely turned. What remains for certain is that there is a widespread racism and colorism issue. In Algeria, for example, where my father is from, it's not rare for darker complexions Algerians to be called racist slurs on the street. In January 2018, Khadija Benamou, a young woman with curly hair and darker skin for Algerian standards, originally from the city of Adrar, located in the desert, became the first southerner to be crowned Miss Algeria. But her win was quickly met with negative reactions on social media and hate messages calling her ugly, among other insults. A little further southwest in Mauritania, activists are still fighting for modern-day slavery to be completely eradicated. Although the nation officially abolished it in 1981, making it the last country in the world to do so, slavery still exists there in practice. According to the Global Slavery Index published by the Walk Free Foundation, 90,000 people were living in modern slavery in Mauritania in 2018. That is 2.4% of the population, while 62% were vulnerable to this type of slavery. And for local associations, these figures do not reflect the full extent of the phenomenon. And we all remember the gruesome images of open slave markets in Libya that surfaced in 2017. They brought to light the traumatic ordeal undergone by so many sub-Saharan migrants as they smuggle their way to North Africa on their journey to Europe. But the mistreatment of African immigrants does not just happen in North Africa and isn't always racially motivated. Let's go to South Africa, one of Africa's leading economies, dubbed the Rainbow Nation by Bishop Desmond Tutu to describe its post-apartheid political and social makeup. South Africa has been ruled by the African National Congress, the country's historically black party, since 1994. Yet, it's had a long history of xenophobia, or to use a more specific word, Afrophobia. Recently, two anti-immigrant movements have emerged out of the rise in digital xenophobia: the Put South Africans First movement and the vigilante group called Operation Dudula, which means Operation Pushback. They both revolve around the view that South Africans have been marginalized in favor of migrants, often from elsewhere in Africa. The groups promise to reclaim or give back what they say rightfully belongs to South Africans in terms of jobs, housing, education, healthcare, or even life opportunities. And get this, the demonization of African migrants in South Africa dates back to late 1994, only a few months after the country's first democratic elections. At the time, concerned resident groups of Alexandra, a township in Johannesburg, accused migrants from Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi of causing crime, sexual violence, and unemployment in the township. As a result, people were forcefully evicted from their homes in a campaign called Operation Buyelekeya, which means go back home. I could provide more examples from across the continent, but you get the idea. Whether it's due to economic hardship, political manipulation, or remnants of a violent and divisive past, racism and xenophobia are still commonplace across Africa. Of course, such phenomena can also occur and be observed in many other parts of the world, but as we increasingly speak of African unity and our politicians meet periodically to discuss a more integrated African continent that could rival with political entities like the European Union, it appears fundamental to me to simultaneously address the bigoted and ignorant ways with which we interact to each other, from a region to another, a country to another, or even within a single nation. But that is just my opinion. And I would love to hear your take on this. So please feel free, as usual, to share your personal experience or where you stand on this conversation in the comments below. There is so much more to be said and shared on these issues, and I want you to please do. I would love to discuss it. In the meantime, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.